Hello, Hub City kids. How are you today? Can you believe it? Today is the fourth and final Sunday of Advent. Where in the world did the month of December go? I would love if you took a minute with your family and talk about some of your favorite things that you've done over the last month. Reflection is just such a beautiful time to remember the goodness that God has already done for you. And even in this season of things being different, there's still so many good things. I don't know if you remember, but way back when we actually got to meet together, we always started our Sunday mornings with, what is one good thing that happened to you last week? And I would love for you to do that today as a family. You can think about last week, or you can think about the whole month, but just take a minute and have some gratitude, because, as we always used to say, every good and perfect thing comes from above, right? Okay. What is something that you're excited about for this next week? We have just a couple more days until Christmas. What's something that you're looking forward to, that you're anticipating in this time of Advent while we're waiting, and we're coming to the part where the waiting is over? And sometimes there's some mixed feelings in that, because then it's over, but we can also be excited, and that time of anticipation in itself is really fun. So today's passage is a little bit more Christmassy, especially than our first one, where we talked about Abraham and the blood path and all those poor dead animals. But last week was a little bit more Christmassy, and this week is definitely more Christmassy. We are going to read Matthew 2, 1 through 12, and remember, you spend some time, pause the video, talk with your family about some things that you notice. This is a passage that you're more familiar with, probably, so there might be some things that are just, yeah, I know that story already, but I want you to take some time, and what are some things that you are familiar with? Maybe this time you read it and there's something that you haven't noticed before, and pay attention to that. And take some time to notice if you have any questions about what you've read. And you can spend some time, remember, telling each other back what you remember from the story. And especially, even though this is a short passage, one person might remember something that isn't what you remember, and it's kind of fun to see the different parts of the story that mean different things to different people. Today, when we pause, I am going to have a super crazy face. So ready? How was it? I don't even know what it looked like, so I'm excited to see what crazy face Mr. Austin gave me. What have we been talking about this whole Advent season? Our theme of this last 4 weeks has been promise. Do you remember the fancy word for that? Covenant, which means promise. And we saw that with Abraham. And could Abraham fulfill his end of the pinky promise? No, he failed miserably. Even as soon as the next chapter, after doing this whole big blood path, he had already failed. But God always fulfills his promises. And we saw in the genealogy that God had this plan, and he kept fulfilling his promise even when his people failed and when his people forgot him. And we saw that God's promise was to send a Savior last week, and that Savior would be with us, and that Savior was Jesus. This week, we're going to keep with that promise. So there's a king in this story. And how does this king feel about finding out that the Messiah is coming? He's feeling a little bit nervous, because what is he expecting? He's expecting, well, a king, right? What do you think about when you think about a king? Usually you think about an army and lots of gold and money and probably a castle, and we've talked about the servants and the kingly thing, a big huge crown. But that is not this experience. If you look through the genealogy in Matthew, there are actually a lot of kings in there. God's people, way, way back in the Old Testament, had looked around at all the other countries around them and said, hey, how come they all get a king and we have some priests and we don't look anything like those other cultures? We want a king too. And God said, but those kings fail all of the time, and I will never fail you. I am your king. And they said, but we can't see you. You're not here. We want a king. We want a king. We want a king. And so finally God said, well, then choose a king. And so they did choose a king. And guess what? He failed them miserably. So then God chose a king, and he chose David. And we've talked about David a little bit in our genealogy. And he had David and Goliath, and he wrote most of the Psalms. He was a pretty great king who loved Jesus a lot, but he also did some pretty bad things too and failed. He forgot God too. He killed a man, and he did all sorts of things that were not okay, but God fulfilled his promise to David and had David's sons and his sons and his sons and his sons also become kings. And we talked a little bit again earlier that those kings, a lot of them, were really, really bad kings. The kings that God's people chose that had armies and they had castles and they had servants and they had all sorts of money, and they still kept failing. They failed the people and they failed God because they couldn't remember him. Even remember the one king who was responsible for bringing all of God's people to God, and they found the dusty old Bible that nobody had even remembered was there because they clearly hadn't opened it or were following anything in it. So what sort of king did they want? They were looking for a king that looked like all of the other kings of the other countries. They wanted a king that would free them from the rulers that were oppressing them. They were looking for a king to come down and establish a kingdom. And even when they had a kingdom, they kept failing, and they would lose the kingdom, and another country would come and take over, and then they'd say, God, please save us. And so God would save them, and it was a whole big thing. But the kings kept failing, and God never did. That was the point. And then he sent them the best king. And that's what Christmas is all about. But let's think through the king that he sent. How does the king that he sent, Jesus, look very different than what we think of as a king? First of all, he was a baby. So is that baby going to establish a kingdom and take over places and have armies? No, he can't even talk. His diaper is still getting changed. He's a baby. He can't do anything for himself. And then when he grew up, what did he look like? Did he grow up in a place with lots of money and lots of power and lots of people doing things for him? No, he grew up in a house that had so little money. In this passage, when the wise men come, they give Jesus those gifts and gives his family those gifts. And then we're told that Mary and Joseph had to use those gifts, and they sold them so that they could flee to Egypt to get away from Herod, who was trying to kill Jesus. They had so little money that they had to use these gifts to keep them safe. So he didn't have money. He didn't have strength. He didn't have power. What did he have? He was God, so he had all of those things, but not in the way that we think about it. He did not have an army. He did not have a big, huge castle. And he did not come to make a kingdom like what we look at, a kingdom. It didn't have borders and it didn't have walls. He blew all of that out. He came to save all of the people, that his kingdom would be established in the whole world, so that even these wise men who are worshiping him from far, far away are coming and they are recognizing who he is. And a crazy thing is his people didn't even recognize him. He came to save the whole world, but who his kingdom, his people, didn't think of him as being the king. So Jesus is different because he came to heal instead of to conquer. He came to save the lost and the broken, not to give the powerful more power and the rich more money. He came as a baby with so little money that he had to take money from other people in order to find safety. Jesus came and he was glorified by shepherds and foreigners instead of his own people. He came to unite, not tear apart. He came to die instead of to create strong armies to protect himself. How else is Jesus different than what you would expect a king to look like? Do you have expectations for what Jesus should do even now? Sometimes we have expectations that aren't exactly what Jesus planned on being for us. And do you feel in your heart, you can ask God to reveal to you if there are things that you're expecting him to do and be that are maybe not true? What does Jesus' birth teach us about how we should live our lives? What does Jesus' life teach us about how we should live our lives? I want you to think a lot this week about that idea of kingdom, because this is our earthly kingdom, and he came to be with us here. And yes, there's heaven and there's the good, big, huge kingdom that we get to be in, but he also came down to establish his kingdom here, and we all get to be a part of that. We get to be his people and celebrate the goodness that is, because he shows us on earth what it's supposed to be like in heaven. So here's a little craft that you're going to do. It's a crown. It's a super easy crown to make. I'm sure all of you have toilet paper rolls because, well, maybe not, because toilet paper is a scarcity in this time and season of 2020. But hopefully you have some toilet paper rolls and you just cut it and decorate it and put it somewhere where you can see it, and think about this idea of king and that God is a different king than we expect a king to be. And this different is so much better than we could ever dream of ourselves. He is a king that brings peace and joy and hope and so many better things than we could ever hope for in our limited imaginations. So as you enter in these last couple of days of Advent, I pray for you and I hope that you find that peace of kingdom and rest in the knowledge of the best king ever, that he is with us and that he cares about us and that he came to save us all. So have a very, very, very Merry Christmas. I love you all and I miss you, and I hope to see you all soon.